This episode is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. Become a patron today at patreon.com/intotheportal. Although the world is full of skeptics, there seems to be a series of never-ending occurrences across North America of very real and very strange Sasquatch encounters. Sometimes violent, sometimes fleeting. The flash of a giant hairy humanoid darting behind a tree, or perhaps the infamous sounds of wood knocking echoing through the dense forests. Whatever you choose to believe, the reality persists that for thousands of years, people have been experiencing a phenomena that has yet to be explained, leaving us with one of the most enduring mysteries entrenched into human civilization: the existence of forest-dwelling beings that walk upright like man. But what are these creatures? Or at the very least, what could possibly explain the hundreds of footprint casts, violent attacks, sightings, recordings, and experiences that can only be described as unexplainable, at least for now? Are witnesses seeing a relic human Neanderthal? Or possibly an unidentified ape, the first of its kind in North America? Or perhaps there are other forces at play here, keeping this elusive entity at bay from the human gaze. Whatever the answer may be, we go searching for it this week on Into the Portal, as we dive into theories in Part 3 of Strange Sasquatch Encounters.
Hello, and welcome back into the portal. I'm Amber Ray.
And I'm Andrew McKay.
We're back with part 3, the conclusion of our Sasquatch Strange Encounters.
That's right. So today we're trying to kind of bring you guys some super interesting theories, and we're really going to try and break down and figure out just what the heck we're looking for here when we're talking about strange Sasquatch encounters.
Exactly.
We've kind of tried to do that already,
Yeah.
but it's tough.
We kind of alluded to some epic debate that might go on between the whole staunch cryptozoologist versus the whole interdimensional / more metaphysical. We decided we're not going to go and do a debate, but we are going to get into both sides of that argument today for y'all.
Definitely. Before we do, though, just a tiny bit of housekeeping. We had some new iTunes reviews on the Canadian iTunes and on the American one. I didn't actually have time to check some of the other international ones, but if they're there, shout out to you guys, and we'll get back to you in a bit. So yeah, shout out to Joel McKenzie and to CC1059, who's a brand new listener from Northern BC. So thank you so much for your kind words. Had a lot of nice things to say. And then we had another one from Dusty Dog 1969, a 5-star review from the American iTunes, and she, or well, I'm assuming, I don't even know who it is, Dusty Dog, I guess that could be either or, but really loves the intros, so that was really cool, super encouraging for me. I love writing and doing those, so super encouraging. Thank you so much, you guys. Keep that coming. Okay, so before we really dive in, though, we wanted to just do a tiny bit of recap, because this is part 3. We've been talking a lot of Sasquatch here. So, I mean, obviously, going all the way back to part 1, we focused on the strange side with violent attacks, right? But as we've kind of discovered as we go through here, that this isn't really all that strange. This is a lot more commonplace than previously thought throughout North America, not just sort of the Eastern fallacy of the marked hominids and violent attacks on the East Coast. What else did we kind of go through? Well,
we had quite a few cases, right? Like we had I don't even know if I even want to try it, but we had the Georgia swamp story that was quite pivotal.
Yeah.
A lot of people reached out to us and said that was quite an amazing story as well. We did, what was the other one? The Ape Canyon. That's huge.
Yeah, definitely.
And that really added to the lore. And we discussed quite a few people as well, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh my gosh, was it J.W. Burns?
Yeah, going all the way back to the 1920s.
And then obviously Lauren Coleman keeps coming up again and again because he is a cornerstone in this field.
Yeah.
And obviously he does take the more staunch cryptozoological sort of take on this.
Yes.
Actually, it's interesting. We were watching the other night, we were watching Animal X, talking about like winged beasts and creatures, and they were kind of lumping in everything from Mothman to Thunderbirds to flying
Territor, like pterosaurs or whatever.
Oh yeah, right.
Dinosaur.
So that kind of falls into the whole Thunderbird thing. But they brought on Lauren Coleman, and he was kind of talking about how the creation of Mothman is mostly just the media, and he takes the position that it is just an unknown winged species, right?
Yeah.
And so I thought that was interesting. It's not like a supernatural thing, because there's so many elements of Mothman, right? And we're going to get into that too. It applies to Sasquatch in a lot of ways, and we're going to have examples from Skinwalker Ranch that kind of lend themselves to the more metaphysical, interdimensional side of things.
Yes,
and then we have the flip side as well.
Right. Definitely. And we also kind of talked about places where, because all of the, like you were mentioning Lauren Coleman, mentioning places like Skinwalker where there's more paranormal aspects to this mystery and this phenomena with Sasquatch. We talked about places where you can experience Sasquatches, right? So Klemtu was one, all across the northern coast, right? Of BC, Washington, Oregon. Shout out to listener Darren Budnick, who let us know that Souk, BC is another area on the coast where you are almost guaranteed to have a Sasquatch encounter and or experience. So, with all that being said, there's obviously a lot of places we've talked about where this is happening all the time. People are experiencing this right today, probably even, right? If you're out in the right space, which really just muddies the whole thing, but makes this conversation so fascinating. But that's what we're going to try to get into today, because people are experiencing it. It has to be something. We kind of have three main questions here that are the crux of this final part. So, the first one is, and this is a big one, how has Sasquatch remained undiscovered in terms of proof? Yeah, undiscovered, quote unquote, because people claim to have discovered, right? Just without the definitive evidence. So how has Sasquatch remained undiscovered in terms of proof, despite all these locales where they frequent, where people see them, where footcasts are always taken, where...
And staunch believers, right?
Yes.
That will tell you, literally, that Sasquatch is as definitively out there as the Earth is round.
Yes.
I have
Yeah.
a great example just off the bat with that, and I'll get into that in a second.
Totally.
But we've got some more questions,
Question
too.
number 2 that's really important here is, are we dealing with a potentially relic human population? So like a surviving Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon man type deal, or a surviving ancient ape species, which would be the first of its kind in North America.
Okay.
And final question really for this third part is, what's next for Sasquatch research? And you kind of wanted to kick it off with that a little bit here.
Yeah, definitely. Your second question, though, I feel like is leaving out a little bit of the puzzle, right? Because we could be possibly dealing with a relic human, like you said, Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, Homo erectus, something along those lines of human evolution, the surviving ancient ape theories, I should say, as well. But then also on the flip side, are we actually dealing with a supernatural phenomena, something that defies rational explanation, that goes into the paranormal realm?
Yes.
So that would be my... But as far as your last question there, what's next for Sasquatch research? I thought this was really interesting, and obviously this isn't super, super modern. This actually happened in 1978, but I think it really kind of paints a picture as to how academics and universities, especially in our neck of the woods in BC, were trying to deal and grapple with this question. And it was a legitimate question. And the University of British Columbia, which we are both alumni of,
We are indeed.
it actually held a conference in this year, so 1978, like I mentioned. And the conference was called Anthropology of the Unknown. I accessed this from Maclean's magazine archives, and I just thought this was so fascinating. They talked about in the article, it talked about how over 150 academics and Sasquatch proponents came together to discuss unknown upright hairy hominids in North America.
Very
which
cool.
I was like, I wish I could have been there.
No kidding.
It was 4 days altogether, and definitely there were a lot of different tones. There was a lot of different speakers, from exactly that, the staunch believers to the staunch skeptic. And the tone definitely swung from ridicule to solemn discussion throughout. And this is cute. There was actually pins available that said, "I've seen Bigfoot," which was kind of cute.
Nice.
But the one thing I did want to point to was the presence of Soviet scientists. So this is 1978, in the height of Cold War. I don't know if this was a hot spot or not, hot year or whatever. But anyways, they were there, and two of which discussed their 60-page paper, which proclaimed the existence of such a creature to be as certain as the fact that the Earth is round. So they were very, very staunch. And like you mentioned, Andrew, when I first told you that, you were like, well, yeah, Siberia, like Eastern Eurasia, the steppes, like all that, like it's more commonplace, and it's almost very similar toned to how North American indigenous tribes talk about it, the certainty,
Definitely.
at least, you know what I mean?
Definitely.
Yeah, and then it kind of concluded with the idea expressed by both skeptics and believers, the immense frustration at the lack of, quote, totally acceptable evidence to support claims and sightings and stuff. And so by the end of the conference, there were voracious calls by both camps for almost like a witch hunt style, like, let's get a body. Like,
Right.
I want a body. And in order for this to be produced, to close the matter kind of thing.
Which
Yeah.
I feel like is such just a knee-jerk reaction, obviously, like,
It
on the
is.
skeptic side. That's one of the questions that we didn't bring up in the beginning here, but Lauren Coleman poses in a few of his works, the idea of, should we shoot one if we have the opportunity? And for us, obviously, the answer is unequivocally no.
Yeah.
Nothing should ever be killed to prove it exists.
Exactly.
There's got to be another way. But if that's really the question that's being asked, it's like, clearly we're dealing with something that's very, very intelligent, that's good at being hidden.
Exactly.
Right? Just like all these creatures that we discover every single year, new species that have remained hidden. So, but before we really get into kind of that's more hardcore cryptozoological side of things, there is an even stranger side to all this Sasquatch lore. And it's a little bit on the ridiculous side.
Is it though?
I mean, it happens. I mean, this is the thing. Just like the Sasquatch sightings in the woods, these experiences can happen with Sasquatches related to UFO sightings. So there's this different side to the phenomenon. These hardcore cryptozoologists, they're going to get their panties in a bunch over this, right? Because there's sightings of UFOs followed by sightings of Sasquatch and vice versa as well. So just giant, hairy, bipedal hominids and then sightings of UFOs. So many of these bizarre sightings and connections have been made that people in the paranormal community, they're looking specifically for this now. They're
Really?
they're researching specifically Sasquatch UFO cases because they're buying into that paranormal
Okay.
side to this creature.
Interesting.
There was even a book published in 1980. This was an Australian UFO researcher named Mark Moravec, and he was
Oh, I've heard that name before.
yeah, his book was called The UFO Anthropoid Catalog. So it's basically looking at all these different strange accounts,
Very cool.
including both.
1980, hey? Like, that's actually very telling because even in part one, we referenced Ape Canyon, how that occurred in the 1920s. But then later on, close to, what was it, like 60 years later, Fred, Fred Beck,
Right.
he ended up publishing a pamphlet in 1966 about his experience, and he made it a lot more. I'm not going to say like psychedelic, but a lot more of those types of connections, right? A lot more of the, what
Like
can I say?
interdimensional type
Interdimensional,
ideas.
yeah, spiritual kind of feelings to the
Yeah.
whole thing. So 1980, this kind of falls in the same era.
Definitely. And that was the era when a lot of this was happening, right? Like with the Becks coming out with that his later accounts in the 70s and stuff. But there's a whole bunch of stories. We picked out a few just to kind of try to break this down because I don't really quite know what to make of this Bigfoot UFO association. There was one incident on July 31st, 1977, and this happened at Presque Island Peninsula Park in Pennsylvania. Okay. So families on a picnic first saw a strange light near the beach where they were hanging out. And the object was described by a 16-year-old girl, a member of the family, named Betty Jean Clem, who stated that the light was caused by an object that was basically mushroom-shaped, with 3 lights on one side of it. And there happened to be law enforcement near the beach that day on the scene, and along with other people that were chilling there that day, including one of the other family members named Betty and another named Douglas J. Tibbetts. They actually followed what they presumed to be a UFO that was hovering ahead. So they pursued this. But as they got towards it, they were called back by frantic screams from the car that was parked near the beach, which was the girls, which was Betty Jean Clem and her cousin. So when the family members that were pursuing the UFO, they all ran back and they found Betty along with 2 of the other young children in the family, Anita, and I'm missing the other name. But they were basically in the car, scared to death by what they would later describe as a massive, necklace, armless, dark, non-human, hairy humanoid figure moving sluggishly in the underbrush near the car. And when they were questioned,
Sluggishly?
yeah, like it was like almost as if it had been dropped there, like injured.
Oh.
Because there's some weird theories when it comes to Sasquatch and UFO. I'll
What?
get in a sec. They were questioned by the police that were on the scene, and one of them actually ended up being the chief of the local detachment named Dan Dasanio, and he stated, like, I'm convinced that these young people saw something. He goes on later to state how credible the witnesses were, how their stories were all coherent, and they had no motive to lie. So here you have a whole bunch of people witness a UFO, non-ballistic motion. It's not moving, it's not making sounds. They go to follow it, and then there's this bizarre humanoid sighting related to it. What the heck is going on in that
The description, too, of... I love this. Just, I'm going to re-quote this. Massive, necklace, armless, hairy, non-human, hairy humanoid. So there's no arms, no neck.
Well, here's the thing.
Massive.
You take out the armless aspect of that, that's marked hominid description.
Yeah, it is.
Right?
Yeah.
So,
aside from the bunny ears. No, I'm just
well, yeah.
if you're going with that one. But...
So, okay, but there's...
Wait, a non-human hairy humanoid?
Humanoid-like non-human, clearly.
Yeah.
But what's weird about this
like
is
a running pair of scissors?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Right? But like, the questions that all these accounts bring up, and I got another one here to give in a sec, but is like, are these creatures, are Sasquatch-like creatures actual extraterrestrials or interdimensional beings? Are they experiments that are coming and going and being dropped off willy-nilly when they're done with them type thing by some sort of weird other entities of some kind? Because that's what this almost seems like. Like, it's almost like something just got plopped down, and here we are with a Sasquatch-ish sighting and a UFO sighting.
And it kind of almost reminds me of when you get either cattle mutilations or cattle abductions, that kind of thing too, where things are like either seen descending from a UFO or ascending into one.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. That's interesting though.
I
don't really know what to make of that.
Neither do I.
No.
But we had to bring it up because this is a thing. There's another, I mean, again, hundreds of stories. Here's another one. December 4th, 1970, just outside Vader, Washington. So winter of 1970, a woman and her children would experience another strange UFO/hairy creature related series of experiences. One afternoon, Mrs. Wallace Bowers was called out to the yard by her children, who claimed to see something. They're like, Mom, come outside. So she rushes outside to see what's going on, and she finds some large, mysterious footprints in about 1 inch of snow in the yard. And she measured them to be around 16 inches long and about 5 to 7 inches wide. And this is what she had to say. This was her quote. The footprints were very large, and the night before it had snowed and freezing hard afterwards. In comparison of weight, my husband's pickup truck never even went through the snow and ice when he leaves for work around 5:30 a.m. The morning we discovered the tracks, they were like black or white. Whatever made them was so heavy it took the frozen snow with each step, plus leaving an impression in the frozen gravel beneath. So that was her quote. And then 3 days later, the family would experience something different. So both her kids and her were in the living room of the home when the kids noticed something odd in the sky. They call her over to the window, and at first it appeared to be a bright light. But then it clearly was moving again, non-ballistic motion, came closer to the house, and they realized that it was a craft of some kind. Basically, the object flew very carefully closer and closer to the house, and the mother noticed a glowing light in the center of the craft, while the children noticed what they would later describe as a gray figure being dropped out of the craft as it hovered over top of some nearby trees. Okay? The weeks that would pass later on, the family would be haunted by loud, thudding footsteps and other strange noises for months. So, did a Sasquatch get dropped off by a UFO here?
Oh, I have another, like they say loud thudding footsteps. What if those are just tree knocks kind of thing, like how a lot of people report?
Potentially.
That's really interesting.
But again, bizarre.
That's, okay, so just going back to the whole frozen snow, the pickup truck never going through the snow, so it's not even making an impression.
No.
So either this thing has to weigh more than the pickup truck, or it made the impressions when the snow was still freezing.
Potentially. Right. I mean,
that's crazy.
Her logic was that, like, because it is, and that makes sense. Like when we live in a cold area or whatever, dead of winter, like when gravel freezes, like, and you walk on it, it's just, you're not leaving a footprint at all. So if you drive a car over, it's not going to leave a tire track. If there's a footprint in that, that's pretty profound. You're definitely going to notice.
Yeah. Well, it was snow and then the gravel underneath.
Right.
So leaving the impression of both. It's impressive.
Pretty crazy, right?
That's pretty. So they never actually, besides seeing the thing get dropped out of the craft, they never actually saw it. They just heard it and felt it around.
Just the footprints and then strange
Strange noises.
Strange noises.
I wonder what other, like, if it was like howling noises, if it was machine-like noises. I wonder. We don't really get any more.
I mean,
of
they
that,
just
eh?
described it as thudding, as if it was a creature walking around their house, like almost like the Ape Canyon-like situation,
Or they're
where
knocking
there's
on the
something-
roof or something.
Potentially,
or
like
throwing
they're
stuff
clearly there. There's
Okay.
something outside the house. What's weird about all of these is that the idea of a Sasquatch or something being dropped off, whether it's an experiment, whether it's an actual creature associated with the craft or whatever, there's other cases where people have actually reported 7 foot tall plus Sasquatch-like creatures, so hairy bipedal creatures, walking willfully out of landed craft. So literally in 1973, this was just one of many accounts, there was an anonymous caller into a radio program in Pennsylvania, so same area as that first report, that claimed there was a sighting of 3 women who saw a rectangular-shaped UFO land just off the interstate and watched multiple Bigfoot-like creatures exiting the craft. So by all accounts, this is a crank call.
Yeah.
But there have been
Let's call it
multiple...
radio program.
Yeah, like there's been
on the
multiple
radio.
accounts of similar instances.
I honestly feel like I might be misremembering, but I feel like a Kryptonaut episode covered something similar not too long ago, where it was interstate. So it was a woman in a snowstorm, and she was traveling, and then essentially what happened was she thought she saw a craft land. I can't remember though if there
That does sound really familiar.
If it was more an alien figure come out, or if it was more of like a hairy humanoid creature. I can't remember that part, but that just, I don't know, for some reason that just totally tweaked my memory and
know,
just brought
right?
that up.
So
Oh.
what? No. So no, we're about to say the same thing. What the hell is going on here?
I'm confused. Well, I'm not confused, but again, right, like it's hard to talk about all these things and have a cohesive conversation about it. So I'm glad we're
Indeed.
kind of breaking it up a little bit and going down this line of thought first.
Yes.
Because I have a lot to add to this conversation, and a lot of it has to do with Skinwalker Ranch. That's a big example.
Yes.
Weird portals, Sasquatch-like things, orbs, all happening at Skinwalker Ranch.
And for those of you who haven't listened to like the Astonishing Legends
Yeah.
series on Skinwalker, because we haven't covered it, go check them out.
Yes.
But it's essentially a ranch in Utah, a cattle ranch in Utah that is known for bizarre activity.
Yeah. So our first introduction was on Astonishing Legends. We ended up picking up this book called Hunt for Skinwalker, and it's by 2 authors, Colm A. Kelleher, who's a PhD, and then George Knapp, who is a paranormal investigator, and I believe we've referenced him before.
I think
in
so,
other
yeah.
episodes. But okay, so Skinwalker is just full of all of it. Essentially, you get a bit of everything. I wanted to read a few different passages from this book. The first one comes from the chapter Orbs, and it speaks to the, quote, invisible giant creature that scared the wits out of this rando hippie meditator that showed up one day on the ranch. Tom, as he's named in the book, they're all fake names in the book, but he's one of the family, the father, I believe, and he led the stranger out to a field as requested by him, where this person just presumed to meditate. And then this happened. All right, so this is a quote from the book. Without warning, something broke from the tree line and moved swiftly towards the meditating man. Tom blinked. He still couldn't see what it was, even though it was broad daylight. It was blurred as if hidden in the middle of heat distortion and was covering ground at enormous speeds. Gorman realized that this chimera, was rapidly bearing down on him. Tom was about to yell a warning, but it was too late. The shimmering, wraith-like, huge thing had stopped just inches from the meditator as it let out a deep-throated animal roar that echoed around the ranch. The roar sounded half like a bear and half like a lion. Tom froze. The stranger leapt back about 10 feet and fell down. He began screaming. As fast as it approached, the shimmering, almost invisible creature, in quotes, departed for the tree line at top speed. Tom's sharp eyes could make out only a blur of dancing, flickering, wavy lines, like pixelated blocks. Within seconds, the creature had vanished into the trees. And that's the end quote there. So that was from page 82, 83 of the book there. I thought that was interesting because I've referenced that quite a bit in other episodes.
Yeah.
But this speaks to, to me, in my mind, they don't actually say it's on 2 feet or anything because they can't actually make out what it is.
Right.
But it's almost as if it's operating under some sort of guise, as if it's not quite entered into a fully physical form.
Right.
But is able to still manifest itself. And this happened quite a bit at Skinwalker Ranch. And during the course of the Gorman family, as they're named in the book, the Gorman family stay, their time there. And then later on, when the NIDS, so this is National Institute of Discovery Science team, led by Robert Bigelow, was funded by Robert in 1996. They actually descended on the ranch and tried to see if they could capture some of this and get some evidence and some definitive answers. And I don't think they ever did, because this thing, whatever you want to call it, phenomena, entity, I don't even know, entities, plural, managed to outsmart them in a lot of ways, I think. And there was another sort of really weird sighting experience that was documented by Colm Kelleher, and it was in the chapter titled Encounters. And he basically describes how his first night of watching the property, he was stationed with his colleague. I can't remember the name of the colleague, but they were at this particular lookout that a Canadian investigator had pointed them to that had been visiting the ranch previously. And this Canadian dude had actually got imagery of a mysterious blue light that had opened up to him and was only visible on infrared film.
Okay.
So I'm not sure, I'm not a scientist, I'm not sure if there is some sort of rational explanation for that, if something could show up on infrared film that wouldn't appear to the naked eye, that would have, like, I'm almost thinking like the Min lights phenomena, right? With like Fata Morgana illusions, things like that. Yeah. I'm not sure if this could be the case to them, but this is really freaky. So essentially, Kelleher describes the experience as follows. Quote, "The NIDS scientist and I gazed out into the field. Nothing moved. Even the dogs were silent. My colleague stood maybe 10 feet to my right. He had night vision binoculars. Down on the right, at the other end of the property, stood 2 more intrepid investigators, also with night vision binoculars. Then it appeared without warning, no more than 75 yards to our left. A silent, bright sphere of bluish-white light about the size of a basketball hovered, moving slightly as if swaying gently. The dogs, which were behind us, seemed to notice its abrupt appearance." Okay, so the dogs noticed.
Yeah.
"The object was not more than 15 feet off the ground. It appeared to be bobbing slightly and was bright enough that I could see the grass lit up below it. There were no obstructions to our sign of light. Line of sight. Sorry. This thing was definitely within our small pasture, so they could definitively see it. And he actually describes how you can see the grass lit up below it. Sorry, I can't talk today.
No,
but essentially, he goes on to describe how his colleague actually saw, using his infrared night vision binoculars, he saw a huge black thing. This is a quote. "A huge black thing in the trees just in front of us, and it's moving north." That's what he said to Kelleher.
Crazy.
Yes. So essentially, the dogs were well in tune with this, got his attention right away, and basically this guy started taking a series of long exposure shots trying to capture this entity that was witnessed by his colleague in the tree line.
Yeah.
And it's freaky. This guy said it's big, and it's in the trees or behind the trees, blocking out the stars.
Okay.
Yeah. I was like, how? He doesn't actually give a height, but big. So I'm imagining over 10 feet tall.
Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm. Massive.
Exactly. So this thing actually took over his mind at one point. It said, "We are watching you." Okay. In his brain. So he like had some sort of telekinetic communication or whatever.
Yeah.
And essentially it got smaller. So the light got smaller, and then the thing disappeared and the light disappeared. And this guy was really freaked out. He just kept muttering "Jesus Christ" over and over again.
Yeah,
Like he was like,
as would I.
Yes, exactly. So I thought that was a really, really, really interesting sort of thing. So you get orbs in this account, and then you get upright humanoid-like things or entities.
That are sort of there, sort of not there.
Sort of there, sort of not. It really reminds me of the first story that you told about how like necklace, armless, black thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Weird.
Very weird. I wonder what time of day that first story was that you mentioned.
Well, I mean, it's a family at the beach. I mean, presumably it's obviously daylight.
Yeah, you'd imagine.
I mean, you're anytime before 5 p.m. would be my guess, right? Probably between noon and 5 or something like that.
Yeah.
If you're at the beach. But I mean, that's this. I mean, obviously nothing definitive from this. It's just a
No.
large humanoid-like figure. But again, that's what people are seeing in places on the north coast of BC that aren't necessarily associated with orbs and UFOs. But we have these similarities, and we have these similarities with potentially marked hominids on the East Coast, with this whole thing with the difference of having a neck or not, or the color being really black, or having other marked features like potentially blonde, like yellow top.
Or if it is this more metaphysical thing where it's like literally this thing is like Predator, where it has like some sort of like
Well, that's what it sounds like with that
masking.
shimmering.
Yeah. Unless it's like literally is it just such a hot day that he is witnessing a mirage moving over the landscape? But how do you explain the sound?
No, you can't. That's, yeah, I can't
There's
do
a
that.
there's a lot going on there, and I'm not saying that either of those stories from Skinwalker Ranch are definitively a Sasquatch story, but they do allude to a lot of Bigfoot and Sasquatch phenomena in the book, and as well, there's a large history with the Utes,
Yes.
indigenous groups
That's right.
in that area, and they have obviously a rich tradition and a rich history involving Bigfoot.
Right.
So I just wanted to bring those up as like
Yeah.
another few interesting, creepy, whatever
Love it.
stories. Yeah, it just kind of, like we've been saying, it does kind of muddy the conversation, but in a good way, I think, because it broadens it at the same time.
There's so many fun things to talk about with this, and it just keeps going, right? Like,
really
we end up
does.
with more questions than answers, no matter what. But we do
Yeah.
want to try to bring it a little bit more down to earth, pun intended, from
Yeah.
UFOs, and talk about other unknown forest creatures in Indigenous lore that could potentially be linked to Sasquatch, and this whole idea of Sasquatch being more metaphysical. But first, before we do, we wanted to take a quick coffee break for Coffee Gator.
Have you ever wondered what keeps Sasquatch squatching all night? He really does seem to have endless energy for his nighttime activities, throwing boulders, tree knocking, attacking cabins and such.
Must be a double dose of coffee. Conveniently hot and ready to go in his stainless steel, copper-lined thermal travel cup. Coffee Gator has many awesome designs and colors, all with the highest technology to keep your coffee safe and hot.
Coffee Getter really does have everything you need to drink better coffee. I'd say they're probably one of the most innovative coffee companies in the business. Even their canisters have extra design features to keep coffee as fresh as possible, including a built-in CO2 valve that eliminates harmful attacking CO2 while keeping your coffee ultra fresh, as well as protection from light, moisture, and oxygen, all factors that compromise the bean's quality before it's even brewed.
And as a listener of the show, you can have the same awesome coffee experience as Sasquatch with 15% off your purchase using promo code QUARK, spelled Q-U-A-R-K. Visit coffeegator.com today and explore all the amazing options they have to get you drinking better coffee. That's promo code QUARK, spelled Q-U-A-R-K. And we're back. So make sure you guys go check out Coffee Gator because they have so many cool things.
Keeps the fuel going,
God,
or is the fuel.
Is the fuel that keeps us going.
Clearly, I need another cup.
Yeah, we could probably use one. But you know, we don't have time. We don't have time, Amber. Because we're talking about a few other metaphysical beings here that aren't necessarily directly linked to Sasquatch, but they're dwelling in the forest. And it definitely falls under the same camp in this conversation here.
Yeah.
And one of these creatures, beings, metaphysical spirits, if you will, are known as the stick people. And we actually came across these in our second ever episode talking about Ogopogo. We'll get to that in a second though. But there's many different traditions of these stick people, but in the traditions of the Salish and other Northwest indigenous tribes, the stick Indians are malevolent and extremely dangerous forest spirits. So details about stick Indians vary from tribe to tribe, and they're described as they can be large, hairy, Bigfoot-like creatures in some Salish groups, and as forest dwarves or smaller entities in other groups.
Including the
there's-
Yakima.
Including the Yakima.
So that's interesting, and we actually had reference in part 1 of the series to these forest dwarves that kind of are known in more like the interior zones, which is kind of cool.
That's right. And in some of these traditions, like we said, I mean, they're not, you don't want to run into them. They have the powers to essentially paralyze people, and these would be the hunters that are going out into the woods, right? In the ancient lore. And they would actually end up bringing offerings to these entities to try to make sure they're getting through okay. But they had powers to paralyze, hypnotize, cause insanity, Others are merely would lead people astray by making eerie sounds, whistling or laughter in the woods at night. That ties into a lot of other creatures too, right? The
Wendigo,
like the what changeling? I'm just thinking with the laughing in the woods. It's almost Wendigo-esque.
that's
too,
what I'm
right?
trying to think. Yeah, Wendigo.
Totally.
Yeah.
Super, super creepy. They're also there's legends of them eating people, right? Children can fall prey to them. They're also known to potentially molest women. They're basically just nasty, aggressive spirits that seek revenge to those who disrespect them.
Exactly.
What do you make of this?
Wow, it's kind of funny. That almost reminds me of like the idea of them taking revenge against people who disrespect them or injure them or perhaps stray into their territory, that type of thing. Definitely reminds me of Ape Canyon to a T.
Yeah.
And also kind of reminds me of some of the stories we came across when we were looking into goblin lore.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. But these
Definitely.
are definitively malevolent, like you said. Like it's not really like debatable, I guess. Like, like they're not like something that you can make your friend like you can
No.
with some types of goblins that'll
Right.
help you. They'll leave you stuff, they'll do chores for you in the night, that type of thing. If you
Right.
kind of like persuade them to do so with offerings of gifts and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
But
exactly. And in a lot of cases, like, there's not even that many traditional legends talking about them because of, in part, due to the taboos related to these deadly creatures, right? So the idea of saying the actual Salish names of these beings in public is considered to be provoking their attacks in
Yup.
some cases, right? And there's belief amongst a lot of these indigenous groups where people still adhere to this today. They won't talk about them.
Or they'll only refer to them in their English names, so not in their traditional indigenous names. And actually, we had an example of that, like you alluded to, right, from Coralie when we talked to her at the Snickwaves Museum about the Syilx people's ideas of the legendary Ogopogo and then some other legendary creatures, right? We were trying to pick her brain a little, and she was quite hesitant. She did not want to even say the words, right, even
Nope.
in English.
Nope.
She basically alluded to the idea that members of her band have had encounters with these peoples, stick peoples in particular, that they are dangerous, you do not want to mess with them, and that elders even bring great wooden sticks with them into the forest as gifts to these spirits if they should encounter them.
Right.
And again, right, like, yeah, they could easily descend on a home if they feel disrespected. They could terrorize its inhabitants in many ways. She was talking about how, like, even like way back in the day, like when they had quite I don't even know what the term would be, like the longhouses, like
Okay.
their dwellings,
Yeah.
essentially, and how sometimes stick people would literally terrorize them. It reminded me of Ape Canyon, where they're poking sticks in between, jabbing stuff,
right.
and just like probably like throwing rocks, the whole bit.
Yeah.
And so it's very reminiscent of Ape Canyon. In
Definitely
a lot of
is,
ways.
for sure. Then, and the reason, okay, so there's multiple reasons why we wanted to bring this up. Obviously, this is a forest-dwelling entity of some kind, very similar to Sasquatch potentially, but there's also this idea that obviously these things are nasty, and there's some ideas in certain groups that to see a Sasquatch is extremely bad luck, potentially even a harbinger of death. And this is something we should have brought up in part 1, but we didn't, and we'll get to it in just a sec. But before we do, there's even more in terms of creatures of the woods that could be associated with Sasquatch.
So many. There's a few here. I'm going to talk about the woodsman, and this comes from Athabascan lore. And so, again, right, this is a hairy, Bigfoot-like wild man living in the forest, moves silently. Okay, rarely reveals himself to humans, so very much on the periphery of our world.
Right.
Frequently known to steal things, causing mischief. There are stories of these woodsmen capturing children again, right? So
Yep.
a lot of consistencies. Pursuing humans, and also attempts to mate with humans as well.
Okay.
Yes, in some tribes, such as the Ahtna, there is said to be only one woodsman who is this like immortal mythological character, while in other tribes, it's more of like a plural, and there's both genders. It's more of like a species or a tribe within itself kind of thing.
Right, okay.
And these actually slightly, in some cases, overlap with what's known as bush Indians. But again, in Athabascan lore in particular, they consider them different beings. Bush Indians are a lot more aggressive, a lot more human-like to the Athabascans, and live in tribes, whereas the woodsmen are more solitary, stealthy, and don't kill anyone.
Interesting.
A bit more on the bush Indian or bushman. It says here, this is all from nativelanguages.org. And it says here, bush Indians are hairy wild men of the tundra in Ahtna and other Alaskan Athabascan folklore areas. Bush Indians are very aggressive and often feature as bogeymen in stories told to children, sometimes kidnapping, even eating unwary kids. So very much bleeding into the whole, like, I'm almost picturing Aesop's fables, right? Where it's like, these are tales to keep people in line.
Yep.
We got the same kind of idea when we talked about Stingy Jack.
Yep,
and how
definitely.
that applied more to swamps than forests, with the idea of don't wander too far, because there are dangerous things out there. And it's not as if these aren't based in truth. It's, you know.
It is dangerous.
It is, exactly.
But the idea of a boogeyman's going to get you in the woods is pretty spooky. What we get, like, what's interesting here, like, I mean, you mentioned a few different things, like, obviously the idea of one being a solitary creature, which totally implies more metaphysical paranormal, like not a sustaining breeding population of an actual species of something, right?
Not to mention, though, like, we do get a lot of examples of, say, like apex predators in our neck of the woods, like bears, cougars. They're all solitary creatures.
Yeah,
they don't live together.
No, they have their offspring, and that's about that.
So it
right?
could potentially be a breeding thing too.
Potentially. I mean,
but the idea of like a tribe in itself lends itself more to like painting a human picture of this as opposed to like an animal. I hate using that binary.
I know, it's tough. It's tough to escape from, though.
Yeah,
like with
it
just
is.
using our linguistics here. But like what we've essentially established with these other examples is that, you know, the woodsmen of Athabasca, the stick people in these legends, they're more or less always negative, right? These creatures are not benevolent at all, and this brings us back to the part 1 and violent encounters. And some of the things we didn't actually mention is that there's a lot of indigenous groups that actually believe, and this is a quote directly from one of Lauren Coleman's books, is to see a Sasquatch is to die. So this idea that there's a belief that to encounter one is a bad omen and would lead to horrible luck, illness, and even death. So does this have anything to do with the idea of Sasquatch as more paranormal, you know, linked to UFOs, the more grand unified theory in a way? Because we do have these other examples of clearly kind of metaphysical entities that are evil in a way or something like that. So there's this belief with Sasquatch that's sort of similar. So some people even point to these modern day deaths that could be linked to this ancient fear of the creature, beyond the idea of it that it's massive, like 10 feet tall. You don't want to mess with it, right?
Like deaths in the woods, you mean, in forests and disappearances, or
yeah, exactly. So we mentioned one in part
in the
1,
50s.
right? In the 50s in Washington.
Yes, in the Ape Canyon region.
And to go back 2 seconds ago too, when we're talking about the idea of like kidnapping and aggressive, like we mentioned Seraphine Long's story where she was kidnapped. Briefly touched on Albert Ostman and his kidnapping, stuff like that, right? But there's some really famous names, but some people believe associated with this idea of harbinger of death, including Roger Patterson. So Roger Patterson, he passed away just a few years after he shot his infamous video at Bluff Creek, California, right?
Yeah.
So that's one example. Researchers Fisher and Krantz, 2 of the men on the 2000 Skookumcast expedition, they died a mere 2 years after their find. There's another story we didn't actually mention in part 1, but we encourage you guys to go check it out. The Ruby Creek incident was an incident in the 1940s in BC near the Fraser River with a family. This was much, much later, but that entire family drowned.
They did drown. It was like literally 15 years later, though.
It was like 11 years.
Wow.
Still a ways away. But hey, bad luck doesn't always happen right away, right? I mean,
you're gonna encounter bad luck at any point in your life.
but that's real. That's
I-
real bad luck, though. Like that's not
That's
just
a
like
pioneer family. Like that was in the
It's
early half of the 20th century. Like a lot of people are moving and grooving and getting into
I
places
agree.
that they can't get out of.
I agree, but moving and grooving across the ice.
Boogieing, man.
I don't think there's anything to this.
No.
But I do think it is kind of interesting.
And it's funny that you brought this up, actually, because I did read that a little bit in Lauren Coleman's book, and he doesn't really give much credence to it.
No, he doesn't. I mean, he doesn't give much credence to any of the woo-woo paranormal stuff, right? Which is important. We need people on the hardcore cryptozoological side
That's
of things.
true. But going back to the whole Skookum cast, those 2 Fisher and Krantz, 2 researchers that died 2 years after their find, that was actually really unfortunate. We did talk about that, and I think it was part 2.
We mentioned it briefly.
Where it was it was like super unfortunate because at that time there was a huge debate going on about this cast.
Yeah.
And these were 2 proponents, and they were there, and they died, so they weren't really there to
And they were
help
PhD researchers.
Exactly. So they weren't really there to lend credibility to it, and it was
No.
really unfortunate, and I'm
Yeah.
still really mad about that. I
Me
don't
too.
like Smithsonian, even
No.
though I did reference them at one point in this episode, but
Just look at the cast, man. Come on now. You know what I'm saying?
so annoying.
But I think we should migrate into more of a let's get into some real theories here,
Okay.
because we've talked about the craziness a little
Yes,
bit,
okay.
and
We have to get into
metaphysical.
the craziness. But okay, yeah. So let's talk about a few different things here. So we've got so many competing ideas as to what this thing is. Is it a phenomena? Is it a creature? Whatever. Let's figure out what the hell's going on here. So on the one hand, if there is a North American population of hairy bipedal hominids, would it make sense that they would be so widespread? Throw that out there. We kind of have touched on that before. So despite wide variations in climate and landscape, from say Vancouver Island to the far north of Ontario, even up into the north of Canada,
Alaska, right? We're
Alaska,
referencing-
all the way into the Georgian swamps, right? So this
Yep.
is a large area. And is it really plausible for something like this to inhabit all of these environments?
The question being, are they all related in some way? Or are they different?
If you want to pose that question too.
Well, I mean, that's kinda-
I'm honestly just going to answer that right now. I feel like yes.
Yeah.
I feel like If humans can do it, they can do it. And do
Makes
it
sense
better
to me.
probably. And then on the other hand, obviously, like, let's just talk about the fact that there is a lack of physical evidence, namely a skeleton, a body, that type of thing. So you would think that perhaps by some point there would be some type of evidence. But Andrew, you had a good point to sort of counteract that. And it's like, really though, the modern search has only been going on for just over 60 years.
More or less, yeah.
The lore goes back centuries and thousands, but
Yeah.
the actual modern search, quote unquote,
Yeah.
hasn't really been taking place over that long. And then on top of it, the people that are seriously interested in this phenomena are seriously hampered by a lack of funding. And like,
Absolutely.
I really wish that the University of British Columbia would reopen some sort of conference or something like that. Or
We should reach out to them. We're alumni. Maybe we can pitch the idea. But yeah, no, like you just said, only really been going on in terms of hardcore searching, mainstream popular culture, people keeping an eye out for this since the mid 1950s, right? And then later into the 1950s with the Bluff Creek incident. And I got into a bit of a Twitter argument the other day with someone, not an argument, healthy argument, right? Debate about just, he was a staunch skeptic, right? We would have found a body by now. We would have found something by now. And I just find that so laughable, especially about us being here in BC, right? We live in a place where obviously there's a lot of forest fires. We're losing forests every year, but there's still 60 million hectares of forest,
Yep.
including 50, what was it? I think it was, I gotta pull it up, but it was like a good chunk of that is like the Great Bear Rainforest in places where people aren't even allowed to go. You're not allowed to go there.
Yeah.
It's off limits unless you're like indigenous. So no one's going in there to look. That's
Yeah.
a good place to hide.
Yeah.
And that's just one tiny little fraction in just BC, not including Oregon, not California,
totally.
not Washington. It's crazy.
just take a drive on any BC highway and
Yeah.
you just look in the mountains and just take in that expanse of vast wilderness. Like
Yeah.
it's kind of hard to fathom. Like even at our new place here, we've got this awesome view of like the Okanagan Mountains, and every time I pull up binoculars, like every night, 'cause I'm like, oh, am I going to see something out there? Like, because
know,
it just
right?
feels so inevitable. It's like it's such a big expanse,
Totally.
everywhere, and especially in Canada. Like obviously, it's a lot more heavily populated in the U.S.
Yeah.
but
still, so, if it's just a small population, there's a lot of places to go.
Okay, so let's get into some of these more hardcore cryptozoology arguments. And you
Sure.
had the bear theory just to jump us off here.
Yeah, this is kind of like one of our only hardcore like Lauren Coleman kind of esque
More like a Joe Nickel.
Yeah, more like a Joe Nickel in a sense, because there's a lot of skeptics believe that all these sightings are essentially mistaken bears, right? Black bears, brown bears, different circumstances of people just seeing bears.
Exactly. Standing up on 2 feet for short
Yes.
distances, etc., etc.
They're the right color, they're the right height roughly when they're standing on their hind legs, right? Their paws can leave very interesting prints that sometimes look more primate-like, especially when they slide, if they're walking on a downslope, things like that, comparatively to other prints like wolf and things like that. But I have this kind of crazy, I don't know how crazy, a bit of a crazy idea, because I'm going to throw a bone to the skeptics here who are thinking that every single person who sees a Sasquatch has seen a bear and is actually just dumb, even if they've been hunting for 50 years and they've seen a million bears. What if there is a bear that is just a hair different, a hair just slightly different in terms of their morphology from the typical brown and black bears that we see on the North Coast. So could it be somewhere in between a primate relative and a bear, not in terms of genetics, but in terms of their appearance? So like a bear species that just happens to walk more bipedally, not all the time, but from more distances potentially, or be seen standing more often. But then when you see it not in those Sasquatch, I'm doing air quotes everyone here, Sasquatch positions, it's just a bear.
It's
right?
a bear.
It's a very subtle switch.
It's a bear.
So
it's definitely a bear. It
I
has
mean,
to be a bear.
there is precedence of this, right? The moon bear in Sumatra.
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of misidentifications of the moon bear as the orang pendek, the little man of the forest.
Ooh, you know what I'm thinking of too? In Australia, when we covered the the bunyip, we had reference to Pleistocene era animals that basically had a combination of bear and sloth genetics.
Yes,
So,
that's right.
Yeah, that could be possibly some crazy weird thing. But
Hey, I never even thought about sloths. There was lots of North American ground sloths. Maybe they evolved to walk bipedally. Maybe we're dealing with sloths here, people. So, okay, let's shift from that though, because
that's kind of cool. I like that idea though. Just before we shift away.
Sure.
Anyways, yeah, that's all I had to say. But you have a lot here on the more. I would say lends more credibility, and that's the whole idea that we're dealing with an unknown ape species.
Yeah, potentially. Lauren Coleman kind of coined this term NAPES, North American apes, and talks about it as sort of a distinct group when it comes to Sasquatch, because a lot of the prints, casts, and evidence is a little bit different, but it does kind of, it props up this conversation. Mm-hmm. Are we looking for an unidentified ape species in North America? How unlikely is that, and are we ever going to figure this out? Mm-hmm. So some of the best evidence of Sasquatch or Bigfoot is obviously the casts, right? The footprints cast taken all over. But what's really interesting is in some cases, especially in the Southwest, the casts are different. The toes are splayed out on a 90-degree angle. The width and length can be different. So, for example, we talked a bit about the skunk ape and how this was different down south in the bogs, heavy tropical terrain, things like that. And they're only about 5 to 6 feet tall in some instances.
The skunk ape.
Right? And other napes of the Southwest. So significantly shorter, significantly more monkey-like, right, than the Sasquatch being more human-like. So this almost reminds me of like the Delhi monkey man from like in India.
Gosh, yes.
Things like that.
We have to cover that one.
Yeah,
hey?
we definitely do.
Oh, yeah.
The other weird thing about sightings of these North American apes, or napes, if you will, that is different than Sasquatch and sort of muddies this, but still, again, is there an opportunity of apes in North America? Could this be a thing?
Yeah.
Is that people have seen them swimming. And when we're trying to figure out whether or not a great ape ancestor could have come across the Bering Strait and be Sasquatch today, great apes don't typically swim, right? They're not, they can't really. If they absolutely have to, I believe chimpanzees and things like that can swim.
I've never seen an image of a monkey bathing. The only thing I've ever seen is that one scene in Planet Earth where there was the baboons or the gibbons or something, and they were just trying to keep warm in the hot spring or whatever.
So they can, but they're not known to, right? And this is something that's been spotted because they're always spotted near water typically.
Okay, the napes are particularly.
The napes are.
Interesting. Is that something to do with disguise?
I don't know.
Like camouflage, like a way of moving and not being, because like animals, a good way to lose a scent is to go in water, right? And
True.
like I'm just referencing even just like criminal escapees that go upstream and try to elude the scent of the dogs, kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Right.
Or the dog's chasing his scent. That's kind of what I mean.
Yeah.
Trying to elude the smelly dogs.
Gotta get away from this. This is just atrocious. So, yeah, I mean, this is again like, are we looking? I don't really know what we're looking for here, but we mentioned a few different examples of this in previous episode, right? So the 1869 gorilla in Ohio example, where the daughter and father were attacked in the carriage
Right.
by what they described as a gorilla,
Okay.
not a bipedal hominid.
Right. And we kind of
Right.
discussed that in the context of the changing face of Sasquatch and how perhaps that book that was published about the African wilderness and all these explorations in Africa and great apes and all that kind of stuff, like how that could have influenced the conversation.
Potentially, definitely. And this would continue, right? Like, it wasn't just these early, like, gorilla sightings, though, like we mentioned in those, was it part 2 or part 1? I guess part 1.
I think it was part 1, yeah.
1949, there were 2 fishermen named Charles Jones and George Kaufman who reported seeing something very similar. They basically rushed back into town of Boone County, Indiana, claiming that they were chased from the banks of the river by what they described as a giant brown gorilla.
Ooh.
And that's it.
A giant brown gorilla.
Brown.
Chased.
Yeah, like clearly pursuing them, wanting to
Okay.
attack them, aggressive, right?
All
And
right.
claims like this would continue.
Brown, though. Normally gorillas are black. Or silverbacks have that like whitish on them.
I mean, that's just the question, though. Is this a escaped gorilla from
Or-
a circus, or like what is going on?
Exactly. Or did they mistake a bear for a gorilla?
Why would a brown bear be chasing 2 full-grown men, though? That's bizarre.
Because he's angry. They stole his honey.
I guess could have been near a cub or something.
Yeah,
I suppose.
exactly. You never know.
So, like, claims like this would keep continuing, though, right? And this still happens today, all the way down south.
I like this next one that you're going to
Yeah.
read.
1968, Kinloch, Missouri. A young boy was snatched up by what he described as a gorilla in his backyard. His aunt also claimed to see this happen, and she started screaming along with the dog barking. This is what supposedly scared off the creature, drops the boy, and runs out of the backyard. Very much a Marlon Lowe like situation
Oh,
with
totally.
the Thunderbirds, right?
Oh my gosh. Was that the same year, too? What year was Marlon Lowe again?
Marlon Lowe was 70s.
Oh, okay.
I think it was 76.
Oh,
Marlon
okay.
Lowe.
Never mind.
But it always seems to be near rivers and creek beds that people encounter these napes, even giving rise to the pop culture creations of like the legend of Boggy Creek.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And that monster down there that terrorized a family near the swamps. And other locals where, Walnut Creek, Alabama, the Anclote River, Florida, Sugar Creek, Indiana, lots of water-related things.
It almost...
Weird.
Yeah, and to me, my question then becomes, is like obviously Florida is a big like wetlands kind of swampy area. Alabama has quite a few places like that as well. I'm trying to think like, is it just the fact that that's the dominant form of the landscape and that's kind of why people are kind of making that connection? I would also want to question, especially with the one with the kid, like, was this thing wet when it got you?
And did it smell bad?
Did it stink like a swamp? Like, because obviously we get the skunk ape. Maybe that's why they call it the skunk ape, is because it smells like the freaking marsh that it came out of.
Right? I think we kind of mentioned that in one of in part 2.
Exactly. And you can also make the connection too. If it's so funny, a lot of this evidence you can just go one way or the other.
Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, well, obviously this is a product of its physical environment and it's just stinks because it's in stank. The other flip side is like, well, no, these things, as they come out of their portal or their interdimensional whatever, they produce a sulfur, which is always not always, but often associated with UFOs and things like that, or even ghosts.
Yeah, definitely.
Like paranormal phenomena that isn't exactly this, but you know what I mean? So you can kind of go either way. I love how we've just like kind of, I feel like we're at a fork in the road and that we're just, I don't want to go one way or the other, but we're just kind of, we're reaching for both right now.
I know, right? Like if you're looking at this, the stories I just gave and the idea of napes from a cryptozoological perspective, it's good evidence in terms of differentiating the ones we're looking at on the north coast to southwest. Clearly we're dealing with some type of animal species that's, like you mentioned a minute ago, different from northern Ontario, way colder, different terrain, warmer, more humid temporal environment on the Vancouver coast, and then the boggy swamps. You're shorter, you've got different size feet, but different hair color, and you smell different. But you're potentially still related.
I wonder if the different, like the morphology of the foot and that distinction has something to do with it being more of like a flipper-like appendage. Like as they're swimming, right? If they swim, then they would kind of like
good question,
splay out.
And be like wider at the top of
Yeah,
the foot
yeah.
as some sort of a paddle per se. I mean, the question really is like, were these just tall tales? And there's so many more, right? Or like I just said, are these links to slightly different Sasquatch, Bigfoot-like creatures of the north?
Yeah.
Or are these just weird one-off cases of escaped animals brought over on slave ships, and then later on in circuses and then wealthy collectors in North America? I mean,
Because the real issue with this is the fact that there is no known primate species besides human beings that have migrated over into North America.
Right.
And so, but even despite this, though, obviously we get these stories, and we did actually reference those stone heads of what appeared to be ape-like creatures in BC,
Yes.
as well as the cave art. But there has been a definitive lack of bones found.
Yeah.
And actually, it was interesting. We had a listener and fellow podcaster, I believe, Pericles. He reached out to us and said he was curious as to whether or not these stone heads could actually be marine animals, like seals. And on closer inspection, I kind of looked at it, I was like, you could maybe, like the nose feature on these heads could be, like, how seals, like, flare their nose quite a bit?
Yeah.
And they don't have any ears. But in my opinion, like, it is more so leaning towards, like, a primate-like
The shape of the head overall reminds me of like a gorilla.
Yeah.
Like it's not like a...
And just to reiterate that these were found in Harrison, BC, so this is near the Fraser, like the Lower Mainland area, but it's not coastal.
Right.
So, question here, are we going to be finding a new primate species in this 21st century here? There are new species being found. In 2012, there was the Cercopithecus iolamensis. Totally butchered
Not
that.
bad. Not bad.
A newly discovered species of African monkey. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
And this was discovered in the DRC, so Democratic Republic of Congo. And together with this other Highland mangabes of Tanzania, this is the second new species of monkey that's been discovered in the last 34 years. And actually to add to that, so that's specific to the African region, I'm going to go over to Honduras just for a second here when we covered the lost city of the monkey god, and they were doing their ground truthing in the Mosquito rainforest in that unnamed valley, which has since been called the Valley of the Jaguar, and they were discovering new subspecies of howler monkeys.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
And that's not even that far away from civilization,
That's
quote
right.
unquote.
And this is just like 4 years ago, people.
Exactly. And like we
crazy,
always
right?
reference coelacanth, okapi. Those are just classic ones that everyone
Oh, they
likes to
are.
bring
I
up.
mean, but they are. I mean, especially the okapi, because that was one that was a true mythological creature.
Yes.
Like in the early teens and stuff, right?
Even just looking at it now, I'm like, that can't be
Doesn't
real.
look real. Half zebra, half donkey, half whatever, right? It's just bizarre. But, okay, so really cool, though. New monkey species found just a few years ago in 2012. Pretty profound, right?
It is.
And we've got a lot of territory that nobody's walking through these days up here in North America. Sure, you can fly over it, but it's pretty dang dense.
You're not going to see anything.
You're not going to see anything. So, how does this all... How can we tie in evidence of actual apes? What would be the reason for an ape in North America,
Well,
right?
and what's the most comparable as far as even like current species, past species to what we are witnessing in all these stories and
Right.
accounts?
And the answer for that is a creature known as Gigantopithecus. This is a idea that's been put forward by a few different cryptozoologists and researchers, most notably Jeff Meldrum, who's a doctor from the University of Idaho, anthropologist, and he's been on a bunch of different cryptozoological shows and things like that. He's a hardcore believer in Sasquatch as a unidentified ape species in North America. But here's just some details on Giganto. One of the coolest ancient creatures, honestly, just a massive monkey. So, extinct genus of ape that existed from around 9 million years ago to possibly as recent as 100,000, but maybe even more recent, according to some researchers, and existed during the same period as Homo erectus. So, living amongst our ancient ancestors,
Very
right?
cool.
Wide dispersed, like throughout India, Vietnam, China, Indonesia, basically placing Gigantopithecus in the same geological time frame as several different other hominin species too. So the primate fossil record suggests that species Gigantopithecus blacki were the largest known primates that ever lived. So standing an average of 9.8 feet tall and weighing an average of 540 to 600 kilograms, around 1,200 to 1,320 pounds
Yeesh.
on average.
Wee.
Massive creatures, right?
That's, and you look at the pictures, like the renderings of what they would have looked like. I'm just like, I don't even know what I'd do.
No. But of course, you look at it and you're like, okay, if something like that could have possibly had ancestors that made it anywhere other than the Far East, this kind of looks like a Sasquatch.
It kinda
It's
does.
10 feet tall, it's hairy, it's gigantic. it's smart
Exactly.
because it's a primate.
The one thing about this though is like it was a quadrupedal animal for the most part,
That's
right?
the belief.
But
yeah.
but could this have just done the exact same thing that many other human subspecies did, where they just stood up one day, kind of thing?
Potentially.
You know, and maybe there was slight modifications to its arms, because like you look at a lot of pictures and those arms are massive and they're like almost as long as its whole body. But maybe you get subtle what's it called? Different appearance and morphologies and all that.
Potentially. Gigantopithecus was first discovered when a paleontologist found a strange molar belonging to this giant ape. And it's actually kind of funny. It was found when he was examining bones said to be dragon bones in a rural Chinese apothecary.
Ooh, that's so cool.
The weird thing about Gigantopithecus is they've reconstructed what this animal was based off of literally just a few jawbones and hundreds of teeth.
Whoa.
We don't have a full skeleton.
That's crazy. So even those renderings then are kind of taking a huge shot in the dark.
More or less. I mean, from a jaw, you can definitely get a lot out of that.
You don't know what the spine would have looked like. You don't know the curvature. You don't know.
We're also
anything,
not
really.
researchers in that.
No,
so
totally,
maybe
totally.
you can. I don't know, right?
Yeah, like to a certain extent. Like you take comparative species that you do have full skeletons of, I would imagine, and
True.
then kind of try and piece together the puzzle. That's really crazy though. Like so that again, right? I love how that is a severe lack of evidence, but something that we have found traces of, like physical traces of, no body found. So that leads to the question, wait a second, did these creatures have their own burial practices?
Oh, I mean,
Did they have, you know what I mean? Like
you'd
ways of
think you'd
disposing of
find
their...
you'd think you'd find something if it was that widespread. They're claiming it was ridiculously widespread. That's a good point. That's something that comes up with the idea of Sasquatch too, burying their dead, right?
Yeah.
So one of the interesting things, though, about the early days of the discovery of Giganto was a thought that they were very closely related to early hominids. So, particularly Australopithecus. And this was on the basis of the molar evidence. But now, there's kind of a shift in this idea of the evolution of Gigantopithecus. And it's now placing it sort of more so in the subfamily of Ponginae, so more closely related to species today, such as the orangutan.
Oh, okay.
Which doesn't necessarily take away from the idea that it could have, evolved into something more bipedal, like a Sasquatch. But it does still kind of muddy the idea because we're trying to distinguish between the idea of Sasquatch as a relic human, an ape, and Giganto's sort of somewhere in between. So it's like, I don't know.
But what if one of these
exactly.
gigantos was like, just saw a pretty looking Neanderthal woman was like, hey, let's get together. And then boom, before you know it, you got a whole new species.
Bada bang.
Bada bang, and
Just
there you
like
go.
the Denisovans, right? Sort of. I mean, they were sleeping around. We ended up with a unique human species there. I don't know. Who knows, right?
Yeah, totally.
Paleontologists basically claim that Giganto has been extinct for hundreds of thousands of years, right? But of course, not everyone is completely convinced that this giant ape, or at least something related to it, couldn't have survived. Maybe there's still something still chilling around. So this is a popular theory among Bigfoot enthusiasts, right? That this legendary Sasquatch is actually a representation of the expansion of Gigantopithecus into North America. So according to this theory, a species of Giganto survived, of course, and was able to essentially make it across the Bering Strait land bridge and able to colonize North America in some ways, right?
Okay.
There's a lot of issues with this. One of the main issues people take with it is the idea that Giganto was only found in Asia, as far as we know of right now. But some researchers actually speculate that Gigantopithecus may have evolved into what we actually know as the modern Yeti today in Asia.
Okay.
They're known to be in Asia. That's where the teeth and molars are found.
Yeah.
And here we have another bipedal hairy hominid seen in the mountains of Nepal, things like that.
Oh, yeah.
Could this be an evolutionary transition from Giganto in Asia?
There is a bit of a gap there. Like, if you do want to go with the more widely accepted idea that Giganto would have died out about 100,000 years ago, the Bering Land Bridge didn't really open up until about 20,000 years ago.
So it would have had to survive much
yes,
longer,
it
right?
would have, or even by that point, perhaps it had taken up sexual partners with other subspecies that it was agreeable with and had morphed into something completely different by the time it had actually made the transition over into North America.
Yeah.
And that would make more sense, right? If the jawbones and the teeth aren't aligning with anything we're finding in North America.
True.
Obviously, the Bering, I'm going to get that in just a second, but the Bering Land Bridge theory is quite contentious.
It is indeed. It definitely is. But if you're buying this at all, if the idea that at least somehow, whether it's the Bering Land Bridge or whatever, could have made it across, here's the connection between Yeti and Sasquatch, right?
Yeah.
We've got these two similar size, similar descripted hairy hominids.
Oh,
One's
totally.
way far away from the other. That makes sense. There is some evidence, if you will, to kind of back this up. In 2013, there were some strange hair samples that were found in the Himalayas and tested, and revealed that 2 of these hair samples point to a possible new and mysterious species of bear roaming the Himalayas.
Whoa.
That could actually be related to ancient polar bears that went extinct as far as 40,000 years ago. So the DNA matched up with this now polar bear that no longer exists. So
40,000-year-old polar bear?
doesn't match to the modern polar bear, and
That's
this
ancient polar bear match.
exactly
That's
right.
weird. You would
So
think.
that is, from a cryptozoological standpoint, that is a win. That is basically saying, hey, people who have been seeing yetis in the Himalayas for hundreds of years doesn't exist, can't possibly exist. We know everything that exists here. Bada bing, you might have 2 species of bear that are more closely related to something you thought died out 40,000 years ago.
Than it is to the modern
That
day.
really gives me more hope for potentially finding a relative of a giganto or an ancient ape or an ancient human still existing in North America. In my opinion.
Yeah, no, that I love that actually. That's really interesting. And that just brought to mind. I was like, wait a second, are you referencing that one Monster Quest where they had the those hairs that looked to be some sort of unknown? I
Yeah.
think they were tying it to the orang pendek, and then it ended up being like totally dyed.
It was human hair.
It was human hair that
yeah.
had died, and yeah, it was just totally
Yeah.
fake.
No,
but
this
that's
is
more
legit.
compelling for sure. That's
Definitely.
really interesting. So again, right, like, well, the next question here, what would be sort of, what are the problems with all of this, right? What are we talking about here that could potentially, counteract all these sorts of ideas?
Yeah.
So the main problems have to do with, okay, so this is an interesting one here. So there is, all evidence points to the idea that the diet of Gigantopithecus was very specialized, consisting of mostly grasses, possibly bamboo, shrubs. So only able to live in specific environments. But I have a counterpoint to that. And I wrote it in here because you're the one that actually wrote these problems.
Okay.
So my counterpoint to your problem is the Albert Ostman story, and how essentially he documented seeing them feed on these fine shoots of young grasses, what he thought were almost like wild green onions. And so the ones that he were with was very peaceful, very much so in line with what I would imagine an ape family would do in their free time, or if they have free time.
in their free time.
Grazing
Get home from
away,
work.
they're out in the wilderness, I don't know, whatever. But I thought that was interesting, right? So Albert Ostman, I'm using you as a prop, buddy. And then the idea, again, that we've already touched on, Gigantopithecus is only found in Asia, mainly China, southwest, oh my god, I can't talk today, Southeast Asia. Where's West coming in there?
I don't know.
I don't know. Where does my brain go? And the fact that obviously there's no fossil evidence to suggest it never reached North America.
Right.
But again, right, we can talk about the Bering Land Bridge. This is the postulated route of human migrations about 20,000 years ago from Asia into the Americas. It's kind of the most widely accepted theory, even though a lot of people will have problems with that theory, and a lot of those people stem from indigenous groups, a lot of indigenous scholars, academics in the field that basically say that this is the BS theory.
Right.
But essentially what happened about 20,000 years ago was this corridor that used to be ice covered basically opened up and supported these human migrations. And this was, again, it's kind of a gap, right? So if Giganto managed to make that trip over, probably would have looked a lot different, morphologically speaking.
Oh yeah, definitely.
That type of thing. And I wrote this in here through, this isn't very accepted, but some people think that Giganto was actually around up to 13,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Which is very debated. And again, right, the more standard idea is that they died off about 100,000 years ago. But again, right, what if there are remnants around migrating to new lands, all this kind of thing? Maybe they were interacting with other early humans, like Cro-Magnon, Homo erectus,
Well,
Homo
they were
habilis.
around at the same time.
Exactly. It wasn't just a neat timeline where it was like, oh, here's Homo habilis doing his thing, and then all of a sudden he just dies off, and then here's the next one, and then it's just not like that. It's all
Definitely.
happening kind of in a big cesspool of different evolutions and everything.
And we have gaps in the geological record, like referencing
yeah.
these evolutionary transitions in history, right? So the idea of Gigantopithecus potentially having some sort of a morphological change because of the changing environment in Asia, and then, you know, its body shape might be changing and might be, slowly heading towards a different world, right? That being North America, and it's different along the way. So yeah, it ends up possibly walking bipedally.
Exactly.
Along the way.
Because that's the final point here, is the idea that there are very few apes that have evolved to be bipedal, and that's basically hominids.
Yeah.
And then their most recent ancestors. So most apes are quadrupedal, and this includes Giganto. They do think that he was, even though we don't have the full skeleton, they do believe that because of the size, right?
Yeah.
The size alone would kind of, you'd be using all fours.
Yeah.
Maybe not all the time, but generally speaking.
So that's the idea with apes. Gigantopithecus is definitely one of the main ones, and then you've got these weird North American apes that are smaller and different. I don't necessarily know if we're looking for that or if we're looking for a relic human, an ancient human, whether it be a remnant of a Neanderthal or something like that. We've talked a little bit about relic humans in our Patreon episode on the Orang Pendek and the idea of ancient human ancestors surviving into modern times, right? Because we know that our ancestors, we existed at the same time as a lot of different ancient humans did. Could some of them have survived, right? Evolving along a slightly different path from us, but still having the intuition, the intelligence of a human to remain hidden from the rest of us, right?
Yeah.
There's some possible evidence for this, discovered in 1989, but more recently studied. There was an associate professor from the University of New South Wales named Darren Cunroe, and he co-led a study of a 1989 series of bone samples discovered in what is now referred to as the Red Deer Caves in China's Yunnan province. And at this ancient cave site, right on the border of a super dense evergreen forest, just to throw that in there to tie in Sasquatch, anthropologists found numerous bones that were scattered along the floor of this cave. And there was evidence of fires could be seen, evidence of it, basically multiple different human populations using it as a shelter for thousands of years. But recent tests show that the bones found, like many similar finds, possess features that resemble a slightly different type of human than our early forebears in the region. So particularly that of Homo erectus or Homo habilis. So this kind of, kind of falls along the lines of the Denisovans.
Oh, yeah.
Who were these people? Slightly different. Even more curious, though, the results of the tests date the bones back to a mere 14,000 years.
Ooh, so that's quite recent.
That's right in and around the range of even the ancient peoples we've referenced to who were already talking about Ogopogo and living in the Okanagan. Ancient Okanagan peoples and stuff like that, right?
Exactly. Okay,
So, I mean, if there were potentially offshoots of humans that were existing very much more recently amongst us, could they still be living in the remote forests today?
Exactly.
So there's a quote here from Cunroe. He mentions the possibilities regarding pre-modern human populations still existing today. Ooh. And he says, quote, "New species are being found all the time by scientists, but with a large-bodied species like humans, you would think it would be difficult to miss. That someone would have reported it or a scientist would have found it somewhere else already. My guess is if it did exist, it would be in a remote place like Siberia. Some claims have been made about Yetis and other creatures being Neanderthals surviving today in places like Siberia and the Himalayas."
Okay.
So we just mentioned the Himalayas a second ago. New bear species potentially.
In Siberia. So it's coming into that neck of the woods, right? And the Bering Land Bridge, like that whole thing is just in that top corner, right? So that's the connection.
So could this be possible? Could there be surviving Neanderthals, and that is what Sasquatch is?
I like this idea. I like this. It is, again, right, the whole human, animal, binary, whatever. But this is all supported by science, right? And the idea of the different lines and trajectories of different species and things like that. I love the idea that Neanderthals and ancient humans were a lot more sophisticated than we give them credit for. And research is definitely supporting that statement more and more. There was, this is the Smithsonian article that I don't want to quote, but I am going to quote it anyway. But anyway, so yeah, they they were talking about this in an article called Rethinking Neanderthals. And there has been new evidence brought to the table in the form of carved objects, hunting pits, limestone shelters that all suggest that these people were engaged in group hunting, dividing resources, had culture, arts, all sorts of things going on.
Yeah.
And this site in particular was found just, I can't remember if it was just north of Paris. It was a few hundred kilometers away from Paris.
Cool.
But essentially, this was a quote from it. It says, "The fact is, this site, in particular the Parisian site, along with others across Europe and in Asia, is helping overturn the familiar conception of Neanderthals as dumb brutes. Recent studies suggest that they were imaginative enough to carve artful objects, and perhaps clever enough to invent a language." So that's cool. What kind of language, we don't know, but could it be similar to what we hear in the forest in the form of knocking sounds, other sorts of things?
Potentially.
It was actually really interesting. We never brought this up at the beginning of the show, but we actually had the privilege of going into an elementary school this week and also a middle school this week to talk to the kids about all this crazy stuff, talking about myths, monsters, and critical thinking and this kind of stuff. And one guy actually had a really interesting point. Sorry, this is definitely a side note, but he was talking about how, like, what would happen if two groups, say, what if marked hominids and Sasquatch from the West Coast met? What would happen? And I thought that was such an interesting hypothetical situation. And like we kind of talked about how, okay, would there be trade? Would there be war? Would there be a common grounds of language to even communicate with?
Right.
You would have to figure out all of those types of things. So I thought that was a really cool example.
That is, and the cool thing about that question too is there's such an inherent like sociological like blanketed over top of that question, right? Like there's that there would be this clash,
interactions between groups.
Yeah, very cool.
Exactly, and how that would all play out, because you would imagine there would be confusion, conflict, all sorts of issues to work through. And so if you think about it, right, if Neanderthals aren't these dumb brutes, they do have language, they have all these things, what if they're communicating with other subspecies? Like, you know what I mean? Like, what if Giganto itself was able to have language, like, you know, like all this kind of stuff. Like, these are all things that I kind of just want to throw out there.
Sure.
Just whatever, see if it sticks. But all these observations kind of lend themselves to the idea that if Sasquatch is a man of the forest, a historic remnant of our evolutionary past, he could be so much more sophisticated than we give him credit for.
Right.
And how, like, we say, like, oh, well, if he was just an ape or if he was just a whatever, then we would have found him by now. We're way smarter than those things. It's like, but that's his area. Like, we are not forest people.
And just again to reiterate from part one, like we were riding in horse and buggies not that long ago, people.
Wouldn't even know what a combustible engine was.
No. So things haven't really improved that much, and like
it's the veneer of
it's been
improvement.
such a short period of time.
It's a facade.
It is.
We're all just distracted by the idiocracy of capitalism. Anyway, sorry. I'm not going to get into that. But I wanted to touch on Cro-Magnon, because he is man's most recent relative, like modern man, Homo sapiens. This was just pulled up from Britannica online, and it talks about how Cro-Magnon, they kind of were around in the Upper Paleolithic period. So this is roughly 40,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago. And they were predominantly in Europe, across Asia. They did have multiple migrations into the steppe region of Eurasia, that type of thing. And they did actually, in this one map, reference the Denisovan Caves. I have that right? The Denisovan Caves were in... Or no, I think...
Siberia.
Yes, okay, perfect. Sorry,
Yeah.
I thought I had that wrong. Anyway, so these Cro-Magnon people... if you remember your grade 9 biology or whatever, they were very robust. They were powerful and a little short on the short side, so about 5 feet-ish, 5 feet, 5 inches, that type of thing.
So not the stature of a Sasquatch.
Not the stature, but generally heavy, solid, with strong musculature. So you would imagine there could be variations within that would maybe be
Interesting.
a little bigger. Who knows? I don't know. It's still hard to say precisely where Cro-Magnons belong in the recent human evolution, but it's very interesting. They had culture, they had sophisticated tools such as retouched blades, scrapers, like end scrapers, nose scrapers, I don't know what that means.
Alrighty.
Chisels, fine bone tools, so they could like carve stuff, all that kind of stuff. And they were mostly settled. They would only move when necessary to find new hunting grounds or because of environmental changes. So that's why you get these migrations into other areas, as a lot of maps and things, if you just look online, kind of show you. And interestingly, like Neanderthals, these people buried their dead. So what if Sasquatch has exactly that, these same practices, which would lend themselves to the idea that the bodies wouldn't be found open in the wilderness.
No, they definitely wouldn't. And then in addition to that, Jeff Meldrum makes the point, along with a lot of other researchers, that a lot of these locations where they're supposed to be living, whether it's the bogs in Florida or the temporal forests up here on the coast, there's areas in there where it's very, very bad for preserving bones. So if you're already systematically burying something in a location where nothing's really well preserved, perfect for not being found, right?
Beautiful. And I can't remember what context this was in particular, but we did have one reference to a cave, I believe, of like 9-foot skeletons where there's a bunch found. And the people that found them, I think they were geologists, but they literally couldn't move them because they were like wet tissue paper.
Yeah.
Is how
So
it was
fragile.
described. So fragile. So you would imagine. And my other sort of side note to this is like, if Sasquatch is burying its dead, I would imagine just the sheer strength of that animal would be able to dig quite far into the earth. And, you know, like we referenced even in our mini-sode that we're doing for Patreon this month, the Nazca lines, these Nazca people, they built graves that were 4.5 to 5 meters deep.
Yeah.
So that's deep. That ain't a shallow grave. But
No,
anyway, so
definitely not.
yeah, so there can be ways to hide bodies is all the point I was trying to make there. But anyway, so the idea that these Cro-Magnons were more so found, like evidence has been found in Western Europe, I guess, kind of leading into Eastern Europe, but I'm going to say that some could have definitely migrated further east and then out of Eurasia kind of thing and found their way into North America.
Potentially.
But not saying that definitively, I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah, because the Bering Land Strait theory, like you mentioned earlier on, is contentious.
It is
And,
contentious. It is. It's gaining ground due to breakthroughs in DNA analysis and increasing archaeological finds, but a lot of indigenous groups are just saying no. And they have their own mythologies, their own histories, and I even had one university professor that was an indigenous man from this neck of the woods, and he just called it the BS theory, which does complicate the conversation.
It does.
I couldn't, yeah, but anyways, I'm not going to touch on that too much.
Yeah.
And there is general agreement that the Americas were first settled from Asia. This was the pattern of migration, but the timing, the place, and the peoples are all unclear. So that was just a whole bunch of muddy nothing.
So that's just a whole bunch of monkey wrenches into this conversation.
It is, and this is coming from peer-reviewed sources. This is from Goebel et al. They wrote a chapter in a book called "The Late Pleistocene Dispersal of Modern Humans into the Americas." Yeah.
So you're the one who added all that stuff into the doc here. What are your thoughts? How are you feeling about Sasquatch as a relic human after that little tidbit you just threw out there?
I like that idea. I like it, so therefore it must be true.
I like the idea of it more than I actually like it.
But what I really just wanted to add in, just by bringing up the Cro-Magnon as an example, is that just that fact that it's so... It's a spectrum of things existing at the same time, right? And that we don't know what was going on there.
Yeah.
What if there was some crazy, like, political organizations and, like, people that had the acute awareness of other things? Like, you know, I don't know.
Well, just like we know that the indigenous populations around, even 8,000 plus years ago had an acute awareness of other tribes of these Sasquatch-like creatures, if you're taking that literally. So this would be similar, right?
Yeah.
So, like, all of this brings up this question of whether or not ancient peoples that we know to have existed, so the indigenous peoples in North America were literally existing amongst Cro-Magnon, like amongst ancient humans that would have evolved on a different path.
Yeah. And I'm not even trying to say that indigenous mythologies are wrong and that they are mistaken in their beliefs that they aren't part of that Bering Land Strait migration. Like, there could be another explanation for how they were there or whatever. Maybe they got there on a boat.
I suppose.
I don't know. But they have their own explanations. That's all I'll say.
Yeah.
Well, but what are your thoughts on this whole...
Well,
like,
it's it's just so complicated, right? Like I'm still leaning more towards an unidentified North American ape species rather than it being more closely related to man. But I mean, I feel like it's just somewhere smack dab in the middle. And I feel like even this conversation, as maybe dumb as this is going to sound, that this conversation of how is it more man or is it more ape, it could be somewhere in the middle, and that ties into the whole metaphysical idea too. There could be some sort of an adjacent type of existence where there's something very similar to us. It's not human, it's not ape, it's just similar, and we see it in certain circumstances, right?
What if it's all just supposed to be like the uncanny, and we're all just like seeing ourselves in different ways?
That is definitely one of the theories that a lot of people have, right? Because it's so ubiquitous. Because every culture around the entire world has a hairy humanoid living in the forest story. Whether it's the Yeren, the Orang Pendek, the Almas in Siberia, the Bigfoot Sasquatch,
Yowie.
the Napes, the Yowie. Everywhere you go, there's one of them. Is that just a part of the human condition? Is that really just a part of us staring into the abyss and thinking that there's something out there like us? But at the same time, there's so much actual, real physical evidence and sightings and encounters and attacks and people missing that it's like, how could it just be that? How could it just be the projection of us?
Yeah, our
humanity's
imagination.
human condition. What I found really interesting about this whole relic human thing is that there's still sightings today of what people believe to be ancient humans that are still existing. And this dates back to some interesting periods in time, one coming from the First World War. I've got two examples, one from 1917 and one 100 years later in 2017. So I thought that would be kind of interesting to throw that. One incident occurred late in the year of 1917, when the Reds were pursuing the White Army. So for those of you who are history buffs, so this is just following this is mid First World War, but this is before the kind of like a weird transitionary period in Russia, right? The troops of a guy by the name of General Mikhail Stepanovich allegedly shot an Almas. So this is the large, hairy bipedal creature that lives in Siberia that are known to the Mansi, the indigenous peoples in the area of where like the Dyatlov Pass mystery took place, right? So this is the Siberian hominid. And they allegedly shot it as it was emerging from a cave. This was a quote from the general. The eyes were dark and the teeth were large and even and shaped like human teeth. The forehead was slanting and the eyebrows were very powerful. The protruding jawbones made the face resemble the Mongol type face. A little racist. The nose was very flat. The lower jaw was very massive. Basically describing a Neanderthal.
Yeah.
So a whole bunch more sightings like this would occur. And this would lead to people basically, researchers assuming that the Almasti, these peoples of the forest in Siberia, are very much likely surviving Neanderthals because of these physical descriptions. So Neanderthals, did they go extinct 40,000 years ago, or are they still chilling in Siberia?
They could very well be.
Right?
What if they're the ones that are in Ape Canyon too?
Potentially. I mean, I don't know. This is
The
absolutely
whole
bizarre.
the idea that it was shot outside of its cave, like that just reminded me of the whole Fred Beck story, how he shot the thing. But anyways,
Yeah. It also reminds me of the movie Strange Wilderness, when they just like unload on a Sasquatch because it like makes a weird sound. It's like, huh? And then they just like That's a really funny movie. We should do that on Film Friday.
we should. Yeah.
Jumping ahead 100 years, 2017. Very, very different place, but similar sort of landscape. Finland. Okay. So after firing up the stove in his sauna, because you know the Finns like their saunas.
It's like a sauna in here.
Oh man, I love saunas. We should go to Finland. 48-year-old man named Mieto, living in the east of Finland, went back inside of his house after he lit his fire. He's getting ready. He's heating up his sauna. He's gonna go have a steam. Right?
All right.
So he's in his house having a snack, and he looks out the window and he's like, very confused, because he says, quote, I checked through the window if smoke was still coming from the sauna's chimney, and I noticed two vaguely humanoid figures exiting the sauna, leaving the door ajar and stalking into the woods. The two creatures, he adds, were giant humanoids walking in a hunched posture. After I lost sight of the figures in the woods, I checked the sauna, and it had warmed already pretty well, only that the door had been left leaking the warmth out. I produced an electric torch. This is all translated, obviously. And with its light, I saw that unexpected visitors had left brownish, coarse hair on the ground.
What? Did he collect it? Mm-mm.
Don't know.
But come on, man. It's 2017. You gotta be knowing more than
He
that.
believed he had seen two Neanderthal relic humans warming up in his in his sauna.
Well, there you go. Finland. So this is
Yeah.
very northern. I would imagine that there's lots of places for those creatures to hide too. Very similar to BC,
Yeah.
Canada.
So again, we're here coming down to the end, and we're just left with this question again with this story here. Like, were ancient indigenous populations interacting with surviving, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, potentially even populations living amongst them?
The bigger, well, not the bigger question, but another to add to that is the idea that remnants from all of these groups, all of them,
Yeah.
Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Giganto, and there's even more that I'm not naming right now, but all of these different sort of subsects and variations and just different trajectories along the same sort of tree in the path.
Yeah.
Could we all just have, could there be just pockets, small remnants? And we're all very closely genetically related, so perhaps the possibility of crossover and of breeding and all that kind of stuff very much lends itself to this sort of plurality, I would say, of Sasquatches.
Yeah. Well,
That's kind of my final thought, to be honest. Like, we're coming down to the end of this, and I'm curious, what are your thoughts?
well, I'm glad you gave that as your final thought. I think that's as coherent of a final thought you could possibly have after this 3-part series, because
no kidding.
I'm way more confused now than when we first started.
Yep.
Because when we first started looking into this and researching, I was of the mind of two kind of things. Honestly, I was never really thinking of Sasquatch as potentially related to relic human populations. I've always thought of it as unidentified ape or this basically just interdimensional species.
Right.
Like, it's living in a plane right next to ours. That's why it's so similar to us, and that's where this whole idea of the human condition and us wanting to stare back, having something reflect back at us that's similar to us, the abject, if you will, or whatever, where that kind of makes sense.
Exactly.
But ultimately, I want to be the cryptozoologist here. I want to, because I keep mentioning the vast amounts of territory, we do have physical footprint casts and stuff. I think that this is an unidentified species. I'm not going to call it ape. It's going to be something similar, something in between that we just don't know of yet. You know how we're one chromosome off of the great apes? Maybe this is a half chromosome. You know what I mean? This is a half chromosome. Not even possible, probably, but possibly, right?
Something.
I think this is a real thing. I'm not buying into the UFO accounts.
No.
I think that those are coincidental.
I think so
I think they're
too.
coincidental, and I think 99% of them are probably hoaxes and not true.
Not true. Misnomers, missightings, and then on top of it, I'm just gonna throw another wrench in there. What if those are not related to Sasquatch at all, but we get the similar description, right, from Skinwalker, where it's this dark, large, upright thing. Again, that reference from the beach story that you told, how those girls, armless, necklace, black thing moving in the bushes sluggishly. What if that's more like a shadow creature thing? Like, you know what I mean? Like that sort of, because it is always just an outline. It's never like an actual. Anyways, that's just the stories that we've told. There's probably a lot more out there that do dive into more nuances and more descriptors that would kind of counteract that statement. But yeah, you're totally right. Like, this started off, for all of you listening, it started off as we were going to do this as like a one-off fun episode talking about old Yellowtop.
Yeah.
And it quickly snowballed into something that we both didn't really anticipate, but it's so fascinating.
Yeah.
It is. So we really hope you guys enjoyed this series.
We do.
We do want to hear your thoughts and your ideas and your theories, feedback, comments, suggestions, everything, right?
Definitely.
So, of course, you can always email us into the portal mailbox@gmail.com. We're always active on our socials. Come join us in the forum. I hope Facebook isn't doing that stupid thing where it's not telling us that people want to join the group.
I hope not.
Yeah. And then any other closing thoughts?
I mean, as always, just thank you so much to our producer, Charlene Ramler,
Yes.
and all of our Patreon supporters. And I know that you guys out there love to believe in this stuff. So yeah, please reach out to us, because I believe in Sasquatch. Amber believes in Sasquatch in
And
some
we
form.
want you to believe. And we're going to run a fun little contest. We haven't really... Oh, should we announce that yet? Maybe we'll just keep it under wraps for now.
Yeah, well, we'll just give you the tidbit. There's going to be a contest, some really cool prizes related to Sasquatch
Yes.
and UFOs as well.
Yeah.
And it's just going to be a really cool little prize pack. So stay tuned for that. We're going to kind of put something together, and yeah, it's going to be really fun. So stay tuned for that.
And on just final thoughts, like everyone, I hope you have a fun Easter weekend.
Yeah.
Lots of family, lots of chocolate. We're going to be at the lake, so it's going to be sweet.
Definitely. Trying to cram in some research, but we are done with Sasquatch for now. We've exhausted Sasquatch. So again, we really hope you guys enjoyed this, and until next time.
Until then.